general public in the UK, following the crisis of 2008, has become increasingly nervous about the size of public debt and also about the ratio of public debt to GDP. It was a big thing at the time of Gordon Brown's defeat in 2010. What is overlooked here is that while a national debt may have many costs and is not paranoid to keep tracking it, it's not quite like an individual person's debt, which is owed to someone else, someone quite different, whereas an internal national debt is mainly owed to another person in the same economy. Figures of seemingly large public debt may be handy enough to frighten a population with imagined stories of ruining the future generation, but the analysis of public debt demands more analysis than that. There are two distinct issues here. First, even if you want to reduce public debt quickly, austerity is not an effective way of achieving this, as I've already discussed, which the European and British experiences confirm. For that, we need economic growth, and austerity, as Keynes noted, is essentially anti-employment, anti-activity, and anti-growth. Secondly, what is also important to note is that while panic may be easy to generate, the existence of panic does not show that there is reason for panic. No less importantly, the public has not always been, the British public too, scared stiff by the size of public debt. It's hardly ever discussed these days, but the public debt to GDP ratio in Britain was very considerably larger in every year for 2 decades, from the mid-40s to the mid-60s, than it has been any time since the crisis of 2008. And yet there was no panic then, when Britain, far from panicking and cutting public expenditure, was confidently establishing the welfare state, in contrast with the confused austerity, not to mention the orchestrated fear that seemed to run down the spine of the terrorized British today, making austerity look like the only fitting response. The scare was not there then, perhaps because the scarers were more scarce. And as I mentioned before, armed with good public services and a flourishing market economy, Britain steadily reduced its debt to GDP ratio through economic growth, not at one go, over 2.5 decades, despite establishing the welfare state. When Britain went for pioneering the welfare state and established the National Health Service, among other ways of providing better public service and more, with Anna Bevan inaugurating the Park Hospital in Manchester on the 5th of July of 1948, the ratio of public debt to GDP in Britain was larger than 200%, much more than twice, in fact 3 times what it had been any time in recent years, and particularly at the time in 2010 election when Gordon Brown lost. Had the British public been as successfully frightened about the debt ratio in those days, then the NHS would never have been born. And the great experiment of having a welfare state in Europe, from which the whole world, from China, Korea, and Singapore to Brazil and Mexico would learn, would not have found even a foothold. Since I'm talking a lot of it, this is a Labour government thing, but let me change the story slightly. When Harold Macmillan, as a buoyant Prime Minister, told the British in July 1957 that they had never had it so good, the size of the government debt was more than 120% of GDP, immensely higher than the ratio around 70% in 2010 when Gordon Brown was accused of mortgaging Britain's future by profligacy. Public knowledge and understanding, to conclude, are indeed central to the ability of a democratic government to govern well and to undertake good policies. The need for understanding is absolutely central. The economic consequences of the peace, ends by pointing to the connection between epistemology knowing about the world and politics, and that we can make a difference to the world only by, and here I quote Keynes' own words, setting in motion those forces of instruction and imagination which change opinion, unquote. The last sentence of the book affirmed this hope. Quote, to the formation of general opinion of the future, I dedicate this book. In that dedication, there is enlightenment as well as optimism, both of which I believe we strongly need today. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what went wrong at the OECD or the World Bank, but I have to tell you, Charleston is persuaded. That now, anybody who wants to ask questions, please put your hand up and we'll send a microphone after you. And while you're just thinking about that, already getting going. Very well, I've hardly had time to thank you, but anyway, we'll do that at the end.
Okay.
Let's get cracking.
Right, thank you. Yeah, the logic of Keynes economics is so obvious that we have to look for other reasons why austerity is being imposed.
Yeah.
And I think it can only be a thought as being looked on as an opportunity to roll back the welfare state. In other words, to transfer wealth from those at the bottom of the pile to those at the top, because otherwise, these people in control of the economy can't be idiots, and let's say Keynesian economics makes sense. So what would be your comments on that?
I know that's a very tempting thought, and my friend Paul Krugman has actually put it down in the New York Times several times. I think we underestimate people's ability to be confused, actually. I think we have enormous ability to be confused, and the world has been, when you think about it. I mean, it's not the only thing we're looking at now. I'm looking, say, in my country, a committed secular country, a Hindu right wing, sweeping the seats, if not the polls, as I said, 31%. And it's a bit similar here now. I'm actually not a great believer in the conspiracy theory. I think people are persuaded. I know some of them. For example, Trichet, the head of the European Central Bank, whom I've known from before. In fact, spent about 5-6 days together in a joint holiday with many other people around in Villa d'Este. And I think he carried out some of the worst policies. On the other hand, he's a very sympathetic, humane man. I don't think he had anything basically against the welfare state. He did think that was a terrible mistake. Because, I think the thing to recognize, that Keynesian thing looked so obvious after Keynes. It did not look obvious to people for a long, long time before that, which is where, of course, the genius of Keynes lies. What happened is that the standard thing to say, you have too much public debt, cut public expenditure, you'll be all right. And with the analogy, I talked about it briefly, with the individual, that's what you do. That's what Mr. Mikovar should do. If you are spending more than you're earning, then you cut down the expenditure. That looks sensible. Well, Keynes comes in and he said, look, one man's expenditure is another man's income. I'm oversimplifying it. And then it becomes quite clear. On the other hand, the first original thing hasn't really gone away. As actually Bernard Williams says one of his things, that the defeated argument is not gone, it's there. And some people like it, and I know Tricia loved it. And despite his humanity, he ended up producing what I thought was a disaster. And then later, after many years later, when I saw him, he was he came to my encounter with I think it was the Bank for International Settlement. And when I had breakfast with him next morning, he looked at me and he said, I heard you. So I think there's no question that there is a possibility for someone without any conspiratorial plan to get rid of the welfare state to go that way. Now, whether some people may fall into the mode that you mentioned, and Paul Krugman actually gives some examples from Republican politicians on that may well be. I don't think that's good. But you see, I think there's also, I'm actually giving another talk next week on the Keynes thing, that's in King's College, based on essays in persuasion. And that's where I start off from, just like this one starts off from economics of the consequences of the peace. Keynes actually argues that that's not a good way of doing, to undermine the opponent. You have to undermine the argument. And so you may well be right, but I'm not going to go that way, because I'm going to be more of a Keynesian here and actually take the argument as it is and say why it's wrong. But I don't say that what you're saying is necessarily mistaken. Thank you.
Amartya, sitting in the audience is your biographer, your greatest, Keynes's greatest, everybody. Keynes's greatest authority, Bob Skedelski, and I think he would like to say something to you.
I can't see Bob. Oh,
yeah, there he is. Yes.
Yeah.
No, I was very much in accord with everything you said. I have one question, though. Why do you think that, given the fact that most professionally trained economists, as you said, did not accept the theoretical basis of austerity, why did the Keynesian argument have so little traction in the public discussion from 2010 onwards, let's say?
I thought that you might be able to answer that question. I just don't know. I mean, one line would be that just the line suggested that people didn't want to hear that argument. I think there was certainly, I don't think it's right to say that the economists stopped being critical of austerity. Not many economists changed their view. It just, economists didn't get hearing excepting economists of a particular type, namely financial economists. And in some ways they had a hearing because they are the people that banks listen to, bankers listen to, and I think people who listen to you and me have less money than those people who listen to financial economists. I think the fact that the financial economists had a huge hold in both the central banks, not just the German of course tremendously, and the Dutch, but also European Central Bank, and initially there was a kind of early, you may remember, dithering on the part of the Fed, until the line became quite clear that the Fed basically took the Keynesian line but couldn't do the Keynesian remedies because the Fed can't do it. It could only do monetary policy. I would have to say that it's not so much why economists gave up fighting. I think it's more why a particular subcategory of economists get much more hearing than others when it comes to this kind of decision making. I think to me a more interesting question is, why did the governments accept the bank's views? You know, it has to be not only European Central Bank. What was the EU doing? Because the EU actually went along. And I think there the magic of what looked like good, sound economic argument would have played a part. And quite why that happened in a democratic country, and also why all this, is not the case that there was no protest about this austerity. There was protest about austerity everywhere. And only after the election, the heads would roll. But why didn't people turn around? What made them so loyal in Spain and Portugal and France and Italy? I don't have to explain Germany and Netherlands because they were convinced that way. Anyway, that's really the question. I don't know the answer. Maybe someday you will write a little on that and tell us about it, because it is a very important question. Why the democratic alternative didn't fire? Why was that? Why was it the dog that did not bark at all?
There's a question here and a question over there. Could you, whichever of you gets the mic first, please? Oh, you got it. Shoot.
Thank you. Well, I loved your lecture, and I certainly agree that economic expansion rather than contraction is what's needed. But I wonder how you reconcile that with a debate about the environmental limits to growth. There's that famous saying from Kenneth Boulding that anyone who thinks that infinite economic growth is possible on a planet of finite resources is either a madman or an economist. And I just wonder how you would see that way of squaring the circle. Is it through green QE, for example? In other words, QE going into environmental issues, renewable energy, energy efficiency, or some other way of trying to square that circle?
Yeah, well, first of all, I note the way of positiveness there when you say either an economist or a madman, assuming that to be an exclusive all. Assume that you couldn't find madmen amongst us, and that reassures me very much indeed. But I think that is a different question, really, because I personally am. Though I disagree with a few things that Gulbenkian did, but I really take the view that what you have to think about is not just being anti-economic growth, but you have to say the type of growth that you have, the commodities that you can use for that. I mean, one of the things I, for example, been trying to get some finance to get someone to work on it is much more what the government can do for environment-friendly renewable energies. That already, as it happened, the market economy has already delivered a huge amount in terms of cheapening, particularly solar. But the problem is always storage and so on. It's the kind of role where the government has always played a part. The storage is a cooperative problem, where individual production is a private business problem. The state has a big role there. And so I thought I would find it quite easy to raise money on that and not succeed in getting any support at all to be able. I mean, I'm too old to work on it, and I'm too old to do my favorite way of learning something, namely ask a student to do a PhD thesis on it. But I think that's the direction I would go. And to bring in that green debate into this and finding some kind of justification for austerity, I think would be a great mistake, really. I think we have to see that, recognize that people need jobs, people need income, people need health care which costs money, they need education.